Good morning, and welcome to our online event, Environmental Factors in Parkinson's. Today's program is brought to you by Parkinson's Community Los Angeles. We're so fortunate to have with us Dr. Ray Dorsey. By the way, he likes to go by Ray, so if you think I am being too informal, it is at his request. I'm Judy Yaris, PCLA Board Vice President. For those who don't know us, we are a nonprofit that supports families living with Parkinson's through education programs like this one, online and in-person support groups, social events, and so much more. Today's conversation is brought to you by our generous sponsors, Boston Scientific, Acadia, and Abbott, and by important donations from people just like you in the Parkinson's community. If you appreciate our work, please consider making a donation at pcla.org. Your donation is 100% tax deductible, so thank you in advance. We rely on your generosity to help us continue this important work. Dr. Ray Dorsey is the David M. Levy Professor of Neurology at the University of Rochester. Dr. Dorsey is working to identify and eliminate the root causes of Parkinson's disease. His research on brain diseases and digital health has been published in leading academic journals and featured in multiple news outlets. In 2020, Dr. Dorsey and his colleagues wrote Ending Parkinson's Disease, A Call for Action, a book that provides a prescription for ending the world's fastest growing brain disease. Dr. Dorsey previously directed the Movement Disorders Division and Neurology Telemedicine at Johns Hopkins and worked as a consultant for McKinsey Company. In 2015, the White House recognized him as a champion for change for Parkinson's disease. Dr. Dorsey, Ray, I'm going to hand it over to you now.
Thanks very much, Judy. Thank you very much, Vivian. Thank you guys very much for giving voice and support to the Parkinson's community in Los Angeles. Judy didn't mention I went to high school in Orange County in Newport Beach, California, and delighted to be with all of you today. The central message I'm going to say to you is that Parkinson's disease is preventable. It is not a natural consequence of aging. It is not a natural consequence of aging. You put mice in the laboratory and you let them live till they die. They do not spontaneously develop Parkinson's disease, nor should the vast majority of humans. This disease is needless. It's unnecessary. The suffering is preventable. And we as a community should ensure that future generations are not affected with this condition, just like our generations aren't affected with polio, not with typhus, not with smallpox. Future generations should be spared the disability and the indignity of Parkinson's disease. I'm going to argue to you that Parkinson's disease is largely man-made, that the vast majority of this disease is due to environmental toxicants in our food, water, and air, that it has little to do with genetics, and that the disease is rising, and that fundamentally Parkinson's is a preventable disease. So the story for the environmental movement was largely founded in 1962 following the publication of this book by Rachel Carson called Silent Spring, in which she argued not against pesticides, which she had recognized in World War II saved thousands, if not millions of people from developing malaria, but she argued against the indiscriminate use of pesticides, especially a pesticide called DDT. These pesticides that DDT belongs to are fat soluble. They dissolve in your fat. Your brain is covered in fat. And you could see a rise in the levels of these pesticides in the general population. And your fat, almost everyone listening here has DDT or its metabolites in their fat today, as do likely I. And she saw this indiscriminate use as having adverse effects on the environment, hence a silent spring, and significant adverse health effects on the general population. This is a picture of DDT. I don't think this is California, but perhaps in New Jersey, where DDT was sprayed and children are playing around the pesticide. And in her book, in 1962, she said this farmer spoke of much illness among their families. In the town, the doctor had become more and more puzzled by new kinds of sickness appearing among their patients. And she wasn't necessarily thinking about Parkinson's disease, but I think that's exactly what she was doing. And I think we'll just, and so this is a gateway for thinking about Parkinson's disease. 8 years later, a Californian, a Republican, Richard Nixon, forms the Environmental Protection Agency. A lot of the things that we take for granted, the Safe Drinking Water Act, the Clean Air Act, cleaner highways in Los Angeles, are all outgrowths of the movement that Rachel Carson led in 1962. So some of you think about Parkinson's disease as some combination of genetics and aging. I'm here to tell you, dissuade you of that notion. Parkinson's disease is among the least heritable of all major diseases. Parkinson's disease is among the least heritable of all diseases. And we've known this for 100 years. Sir William Gowers, a very prominent British neurologist in the late 1800s, said, of my patients, only 15% of them have a family history of the disease. And indeed, today, only 15% of people with Parkinson's disease have a family history. And we know that only about 15 to 20% of people carry a genetic risk factor for the disease, and that these genetic risk factors, by and large, are insufficient to cause the disease by themselves. If you carry a LRRK2 mutation, the majority of individuals carrying a LRRK2 mutation will never develop Parkinson's disease. If you carry a GBA mutation, the most common genetic risk factor known, 90% of people will not develop Parkinson's disease. So if it's not due to hereditary for the vast majority of individuals with Parkinson's disease, what's it due to? And I think it's due to these three environmental toxicants. Certain pesticides, especially a pesticide called Paraquat, widely sprayed on farms in California today. Some of you were likely exposed to Paraquat. Some of you know more about Paraquat than I do. If you were exposed to Paraquat and you think you got Parkinson's because of it, I'd love to hear about it. Or if you got exposure to any of these chemicals, I'd love to hear about it. You can just email me at info@endingpd.org, info@endingpd.org, and maybe we can just put that in the chat. The second cause is this chemical called trichloroethylene. So all of you know that water is H2O is made up of 3 atoms, 2 hydrogens and 1 oxygen. Trichloroethylene is made up of a whopping 6 atoms, 2 carbons in black, 1 hydrogen in white, and 3 chlorine atoms, trichloroethylene, and green, hence its name. This chemical and a closely related chemical called perchloroethylene, 1 additional chlorine atom, are widely used. They've been used in dry cleaning, and California is phasing out perchloroethylene in dry cleaning. And still used in degreasing. It's contaminated thousands of sites throughout the country, including in less than a half mile from where I went to high school in Newport Beach, California, and in scores of places likely near where you live or have lived in the past. It's also the chemical that's underneath the marine base Camp Lejeune and contaminates drinking water, and it's associated with a 500% increased risk of Parkinson's, 500%. And the third major risk factor, and I think one that was really prominent in 1800 London, was air pollution. Many of you know, have firsthand experience with air pollution. So when you see smog over Los Angeles, what you're seeing is little pieces of dirt and soot. The fancy term is particulate matter. Most of those pieces of dirt and soot we cough out or sneeze out, but some are so small, about 1/70th the width of my hair, that we inhale them, they go up the nose, responsible for the smell. And the first place that we see the pathology of Parkinson's disease is in the smell center of the brain. Many of you know that loss of smell is an early feature of both Parkinson's and Alzheimer's disease. And increasing studies link air pollution to Parkinson's and especially to Alzheimer's disease. I'm going to spend less on also in air pollution in future slides. I'll just say this. A study done in Los Angeles at USC looked at women in their 70s who had normal cognition in their 70s and followed them for 5 to 10 years, and found that in women who didn't have cognitive impairment at baseline, those who lived in the most polluted areas of Los Angeles had the highest decline in cognitive function compared to those who lived in areas of Southern California with cleaner air. I always say if you want to live a short and unhealthy life, breathe polluted air. All these things are preventable, all are addressable. The air in Los Angeles today is cleaner than it was in the 1950s and 60s and 70s. There are more people living in Los Angeles, driving more cars, greater distances, and the air is cleaner and the economy is stronger. I'll say that again, more people driving more cars, greater distances in Los Angeles, in Southern California today, economy is greater, and air pollution is lower. You can have better environment, healthier lives, and a growing economy all at the same time. So let's talk about Paraquat. So Paraquat was created in the 1950s, been used in the United States since the 1960s. It's considered the most toxic weed killer ever created. It kills the weeds that Roundup doesn't. It's been used to commit homicide and suicide. Over 30 countries have banned the chemical, including China, but the United States still permits its use. It's being sprayed on farms likely today, miles away from where you live. It's associated with a 150% increased risk of Parkinson's disease. When it's fed to laboratory animals, they develop the clinical and pathological features of Parkinson's disease. Use of the chemical, including in California, for the data for which we have the most recent data available, use has doubled in the last 5 years. So a pesticide that China has banned, the United States permits its use, and it's permitting it in increasing amounts. This is an article from the LA Times just from December, highlighting the adverse effects of Paraquat on Californians. This man worked in Riverside County and was using Paraquat to kill weeds. I don't even think he was working on a farm. And it just tells, the effects of Paraquat on this individual's life. You all know the effects of Parkinson's disease far better than I do on personal life, but there's no need that people should be developing Parkinson's disease so we can have a weed killer from the 1950s continue to be sprayed on our farms. None of us would drive in a car. None of us would fly in the airplanes from the 1950s. If engineers can develop safer airplanes and safer cars, they can certainly develop safer weed killers. And a great article from 2 years ago from The Guardian, a British investigational journal, looked at legal documents that the manufacturer of Paraquat had submitted in response to lawsuits from people who attributed their Parkinson's disease to Paraquat, have found that the company knew about the risks of the ties to Parkinson's disease and covered them up. So if you ask yourself, why don't I know about this? Why don't I know more about that? That is likely or possibly due to deliberate actions by the company to sow ignorance. According to the reporting from The Guardian, the Paraquat was identified as a weed killer in 1955. 1962 was introduced into the UK and then the US. And the company in the 1960s showed that when they exposed Paraquat in high doses to rabbits, to mice, and to rats, they all developed symptoms of Parkinson's disease. So we've known for 50 years, according to research done by the manufacturer, that 3 different mammalian species exposed to Paraquat developed the features of Parkinson's disease. This has all occurred before I was even born. In 1974, so nearly 50 years ago, regulators are concerned that workers, quote, who might inadvertently lick small quantities of Paraquat residue off their lips or inhale Paraquat mist, they were concerned about the health effects. EPA is considered 1974, 50 years ago, to be some in the EPA are in favor of banning Paraquat. 1976, an autopsy of a farm worker showed degenerative changes in the substantia nigra, which, as you all know, is the pathological features of Parkinson's disease. A study done in Canada in the 1980s, 40 years ago, showed a near perfect correlation, never see this in science, a near perfect correlation between use of pesticides and prevalence of Parkinson's disease in rural areas of Canada. Same study has been replicated in France and I think also in Israel. Internal company memo warns of Paraquat becoming a huge liability as Parkinson's can go on for decades, and they were exactly right. So I shared this all with one of my friends who's an English professor at the Rochester Institute of Technology, and he said, Ray, this is agnotology. And like all of you, I was like, what in the world is agnotology? Well, he goes, Ray, science is the production of knowledge, ideally for the public's good. Agnotology is a deliberate production of ignorance, often for commercial benefit. And it was really first came into vogue when looking at the tobacco industry. And, they initially said smoking was good for you, right? They had doctors showing doctors smoking and extolling the benefits of it. Then they said, stop saying that. And they said it's not harmful. And then they said, it's just a little bit harmful. And then they said, we need more research. We're not sure. Their slogan internally was doubt is our product. We all remember the tobacco executives coming to Congress 30 years ago, swearing to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth about their product, and then proceeding to do exactly the opposite. I don't think a single person listening to this call has not had the adverse effects of smoking affect their family. And the same thing is being applied to social media. The same thing's been applied to the use of opioids. Same thing's being applied to a wide range of topics affecting our environment and our health. And this has been applied to Paraquat. And if this has been applied to Paraquat for Parkinson's disease, we should ask, to what other environmental toxicants is this being applied to that affect Parkinson's disease? And then to what other environmental toxicants does this apply to that affect other brain diseases like Alzheimer's, like autism, like intellectual disabilities? And then how does this apply to other diseases just in general? And so trichloroethylene is the compound that I've been obsessed with for the last 5 years. Very simple molecule, as I said, widely used in degreasing, dry cleaning, and it was even used to decaffeinate coffee in the 1970s. So if you were drinking decaffeinated coffee in the 1970s, you were likely drinking this chemical. It was also been used in a wide range of workers. It's estimated that in the 1970s, 10 million Americans worked with these chemicals. And so you can see the list of things, everything from aircraft and jet engine mechanics to dry cleaners, computer specialists, painters and printers, shoemakers, taxidermists, and varnish workers. If you've worked with this chemical, I'd love to hear from you. Again, info@endingpd.com. Wide range of commercial and consumer uses. If you sprayed something on your engine and the grease melted away in the 1970s, that could have been from trichloroethylene. It's used in adhesives, degreasers, decaffeinated coffee, as I mentioned, film cleaners, glue, gun cleaners, carpet cleaners, pesticides, refrigerants, typewriter correction fluid. Do you guys remember typewriter correction fluid? And wood finishes, and a wide number of consumer, commercial, military, and industrial uses. As you all know, you don't get exposed to these chemicals and develop Parkinson's disease the next day. You likely get exposed to these chemicals perhaps when you're young, perhaps as early as when you're in your mother's womb, and then you develop the disease decades or generations later. Just like you don't smoke a cigarette and develop lung cancer the next day, it takes years of exposure often, and then it takes years or decades for the disease to unfold. This is the research that Dr. Caroline Tanner and her colleague Sam Goldman and others looked at twins from World War II, and they looked at twins who had hobby or occupational exposure to TCE and those who didn't. They found that twins who had the hobby or occupational exposure to TCE had a 500% increased risk of developing Parkinson's disease. The time lag between exposure and development of the disease was 10 to 40 years. And because of its widespread use, they said the potential public health implications are substantial. Parkinson's, turns out Parkinson's disease is probably among the, not going to say less, is not even the most important risk factor associated with TCE. TCE is a known carcinogen. It causes cancer. This isn't my opinion. This is the opinion of the World Health Organization, the opinion of the Department of Health and Human Services, the opinion of the Environmental Protection Agency, which says that TCE is carcinogenic in humans by all routes of exposure. That would include inhalation, that would include skin contact, that would include drinking contaminated water like Marines did at Camp Lejeune. A report from the CDC said that TCE was associated with excess incidences of liver cancer, kidney cancer, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, prostate cancer, and multiple myeloma. There are likely other cancers like brain cancer that are also linked to the disease. Earlier this year, the Wall Street Journal had a front page article showing that the number of portion of Americans under 50 with cancer was rising. So at the same time that smoking, the biggest known environmental risk factor for cancer, is decreasing in the United States, the number of people, young adults under 50 getting cancer in the United States is increasing. This isn't adequately explained by screening, which usually doesn't begin until around age 50. And it's unclear what's causing it, unlikely to be genetics because of the short time period which is rising. And makes you think about what are the environmental toxicants in our environment contributing to cancer. I mentioned that TCE was contaminated at Camp Lejeune. Their contamination was up to 3,000 times the levels that were permitted to be safe. Marines from 1953 and 1987 were drinking trichloroethylene in their drinking water. The Marines knew about it for the latter years and did nothing about it. The Marines knowingly exposed the best and brightest of Americans to a cancer-causing chemical and didn't take actions to protect the health of their own Marines. Research done by Dr. Caroline Tanner and Sam Goldman, same individuals who did that twin study. This was the study came out last year, one of the most read, most influential articles in the whole field of neurology from last year, finding that Marines at Camp Lejeune who were exposed to TCE, liking their drinking water, had a 70% increased risk of developing Parkinson's disease compared to Marines at Camp Pendleton, which was also contaminated with TCE, albeit at lower levels. So these were Marines who were healthy. They were on average age 20, and 35 years later, they had a 70% increased risk of developing Parkinson's disease. The study's findings suggest that exposure to TCE in water may increase the risk of Parkinson's. Millions worldwide have been and continue to be exposed to this ubiquitous environmental contaminant, and you're not immune. In addition to getting in the drinking water, TCE often contaminates up to 30% of groundwater in the United States. And then many of you know that radon can evaporate from underlying soil and enter people's homes and cause lung cancer. And so many of you have had your basements tested for radon and had very simple remediation systems put in to prevent that contamination. TCE can evaporate from contaminated groundwater and soil that can migrate a mile or more from contaminated sites, enter people's homes, schools, and workplaces, often undetected, and cause cancer and likely increase the risk of Parkinson's disease. This process is called vapor intrusion. I said to myself, well, where's the last place this is going to happen? So I did a simple Google search. I Googled Newport Beach, California, where I went to high school, and I said trichloroethylene, thinking I would find nothing. But to my great surprise and really horror, I found a lot. So in Newport Beach, California, it used to be a large aerospace facility that produced missiles, among other things. And they evidently used trichloroethylene as a degreasing chemical and perhaps for other uses. And that area has contaminated Newport Beach, California, this large now residential area that used to be an industrial area that's right near the Pacific Ocean. This is about 3 miles from PCH, Pacific Coast Highway, and right near an area of Newport Beach called the Back Bay. This aerospace facility operated from the 1950s until the early 1990s when it was closed. They were initially, they found TCE and PCE perchloroethylene in the soil and the groundwater in the 1990s. They updated standards and became more aware about this possibility of vapor intrusion. And they found TCE and PCE in 2018 and 2022 in the soil gas that were above screening levels at multiple sites, in some cases 100 times above screening levels in Newport Beach, California. Yeah. In 2022, they found TCE and PCE in this above screening levels in the indoor air of 123 homes in Newport Beach, California. So multi-million-dollar homes in Newport Beach, California, TCE and PCE and levels above screening levels. Vapor intrusion they thought was to occur in 27. The solution they offered was air purifying units. I'll let you decide whether that would be an adequate remedy in your mind. My understanding is that in 2023, 2024, so some 30 years after the aerospace unit was closed, some 50 to 60 years after contamination may have begun, that soil vapor extraction systems are being installed. To my knowledge, there's been no systematic health assessments of current or former residents in this community. If this is happening in Newport Beach, California, I submit to you it could be happening just about anywhere in the country, and for that matter, almost anywhere in the world where TCE has been used. This is a closer look at these monitoring wells that are in Newport Beach, California. For those of you familiar with Newport Beach, this is Jamboree Road. This is East Bluffs Avenue. My high school is up here in the upper left-hand corner, just beyond my pointer. And so these are levels of the monitoring wells from 2019 showing that TCE and PCE at levels that are far beyond what are deemed to be safe. These are levels of, 25,000, 2,000, 18,000. I think the levels should be around 5 or lower, but somewhere in that nature. Some of them are non-detected. This is all along homes along a beautiful golf course in Newport Beach, California. This is what a monitoring well looks like. I didn't know what that. I'm a neurologist, not a toxicologist, not an environmental scientist. This is what a monitoring well looks like. This is the one closest to my high school, which is where I went to high school, which is just right back here. You can see the parking lot for Corona del Mar High School, and this edge of this underground plume of contaminated groundwater with TCE. I think it should surprise no one that Parkinson's disease is rising. In fact, it's the fastest growing brain disease in the world. The number of people with the disease has doubled in the last 25 years, and absent change, if our generation does nothing, will double again in the coming 25 years. 200 Americans will be diagnosed with Parkinson's disease today, and 100 Americans will die of Parkinson's disease today. In fact, in 2021, over 4,000 Californians died from Parkinson's disease. According to the CDC, Parkinson's disease is now the 14th leading cause of death in the US. And if you look at the number of new cases for Parkinson's disease, you can see that Southern California has among the highest new cases of Parkinson's disease in the country. And you can see the Central Valley, where Paraquat is widely used, also seems to be disproportionately affected. So if I'm right that environmental toxicants are fueling the rise of Parkinson's disease, then the hopeful conclusion we can draw from that is Parkinson's disease is preventable. And as far as I know, there's only one really high quality study that showed that the number of new cases of Parkinson's disease is decreasing, and that's in the Netherlands, in the Rotterdam study, which showed a 60% decrease in the number of new cases of Parkinson's disease between 1990 and 2012. When I saw that study, the authors didn't have a clear explanation for their finding. I went back and looked at pesticides, trichloroethylene, and air pollution. So this isn't ideally the way you would do the study. Ideally, you would follow levels of these contaminants and then see what happens going forward. But I went back looking for pesticides, and it turned out that the levels of DDT, dieldrin, and other pesticides dropped in a short time period between 1968 and 86 by 75 to 90%. So levels of DDT and other fat-soluble pesticides dropped in the fatty tissue of the general population, in the Netherlands, between 75 and 90% in just a short 18-year time period. In 1981, years before this drop in levels of Parkinson's disease, TCE levels in the Netherlands were among the lowest in all of Europe. And air pollution between 1990 and 2012 decreased by more than 50%, some cases up to 90% of common air pollutants in the air in the Netherlands. So you saw substantial decreases in pesticides and trichloroethylene and air pollution preceding this decline and the incidence of Parkinson's disease in the Netherlands. So one of my sons is a budding philosopher, and one day he asked me, "Dad, do you know who Derek Parfit is?" Anyone got a Derek Parfit? Anyone know who Derek Parfit is? Raise your hand if you know who Derek Parfit is. Seems like no one's doing any better than I did. So I go, "No, Thomas, I don't know who Derek Parfit is." And he goes, "Dad, he's only the most influential philosopher of the second half of the 20th century." I'm like, okay. And so he introduced me to Derek Parfit, who argued that we should care about people regardless of geography. So he says we should care about people who live right next to us, and we should care about people who are really, really far away from us. If we had an infinitely long arm, we would put our arms around people who are hurting, who are next to us, and our arms around people who live far away. And if he says, if you care about people independent of distance, we should care about people independent of time. And so he said we should care a lot about future generations. And so one disciple of Derek Parfit is a young philosopher named William McCaskill, who wrote this really good book called What We Owe the Future. And he argues that we should think about what decisions we make today as a society and what impact they'll have not just on our contemporaries, but on future generations. And he argues if we humans take care of ourselves, there'll be many more people in the future than there are today. So our decisions we make today might even have larger impact on future generations than decisions we make for current generations. And if you think about this, is really true for polio. Many of you remember that in the 1930s that we closed swimming pools in Los Angeles community centers, houses of worship, because of the fear of polio. In 1938, a March of Dimes began. 17 years later, Jonas Salk in Pittsburgh announced the development of a vaccine to prevent polio. Today, we live in a world where polio largely doesn't exist. We don't have any cures for polio. We just live in a world, we just prevent polio for the vast majority of the world. In 1980, a Californian, the daughter of a Californian, Candace Leitner, a 13-year-old girl, was struck by a drunk driver and killed. She was walking her street going to a fair and was hit so hard she was flown out of her shoes and died shortly after she was struck. 4 days later, her mother, Candace Leitner, started lobbying the state legislature in California. I think she went to Governor Jerry, who's then governor, every day for a year. Her efforts eventually led to what became Mothers Against Drunk Driving. In the 1980s, drinking and driving was legal in some states in the United States. Drinking and driving in the 1980s was legal. By 1988, in just 8 years, drinking and driving is illegal in all 50 states. The drinking age is raised from 18 to 21. Blood alcohol levels dropped to 0.08. Today, this year, 10,000 fewer Americans will die from drinking and driving than did in 1980. 10,000 Americans, 10,000 families, 10,000 schools, 10,000 communities will not be affected from drinking and driving because of the efforts of Candace Leitner and Mothers Against Drunk Driving. In 1987, a new disease was rapidly emerging in San Francisco and in New York. It was rapidly and uniformly fatal. There was an absence of federal response. And in 1987, a group of activists in New York formed an organization called ACT UP, and they adopted the slogan of silence equals death. Because for people with HIV in the 1980s, silence did equal death. If they didn't make their voices heard, they were all going to die. 8 years after HIV activists made many of us uncomfortable, they barricaded the streets of New York. They overtook the FDA. They overtook the New York Stock Exchange. They barricaded themselves in pharmaceutical companies who were developing drugs for HIV because they were pricing them too high and not making them accessible for everyone with the disease. 8 years after they formed, the first protease inhibitors were developed. And today, people with HIV can live a near normal life expectancy. And millions of us, millions, if not tens of millions of us, never developed HIV because of their heroism. And the beauty of this, the beauty of polio, the beauty of Candace Leitner, the beauty of ACT UP is none of us know who actually has benefited from their efforts. These are all gifts that we've received from previous generations. And just like you have an obligation to receive a gift, you have an obligation to reciprocate. And so my challenge to all of us, including to me, is to create a world where Parkinson's disease is increasingly rare. As a neurologist, I can't think of a better gift for future generations than one where the disease that I'm responsible for serving that community just doesn't exist. Just like we don't live in a world that's affected by smallpox, we don't live in a world affected by typhus, don't live in a world that's largely affected by polio. We can create a world where future generations in a relatively short period of time see that Parkinson's disease is declining, not rising, and in future generations have a world that's largely free of Parkinson's disease. Thanks very much.
Wow. So much to take in, and I hope that those of you that are watching this are looking at this slide. Obviously, you will have access to it. You'll be able to read Ray's book, which is amazing. He had some incredible collaborators with him putting this together. Um, and I just think that this is such important information for us, Ray. The people that are on this webinar are more than likely people that have PD or they have a loved one that has PD. And I want to get to questions in the chat. So let's kind of go in there first. It says, "Hi, I live in the UK and I understand the pesticide is produced in the UK and shipped to America. This is terrible, as it is banned in the UK. I was fortunate to be invited to the House of Parliament yesterday, and I brought this up with the MPs, and it should be banned." So, yes.
Yeah. So 250 years ago, American patriots refused to accept British tea into the United States because it was putting a huge tax and undermining the development of the United States. Today, we import Paraquat from the UK, which has deemed it so unsafe that they don't use it on their own population, but they export it to the United States, Brazil, and Mexico. Just like we did 250 years ago, we should not be receiving those imports. If American patriots didn't accept British tea 250 years ago, why are Americans accepting a weed killer that's associated with 150% increased risk of Parkinson's disease?
Yeah, it just does not make sense to me. Someone here, Diane writes, "Was paraquat sprayed on strawberry fields? How is it usually disseminated?"
So I don't know about strawberries. Corn, cotton, and vineyards are things. It was widely sprayed as part of the war on drugs. It was sprayed on marijuana fields in Mexico, which made their way up to California. Some of you watched the movie The Big Lebowski, and they make a reference to not being a quat because some of this paraquat laced marijuana made its way into Southern California. So much so that coming out of Vietnam, the federal government sprayed paraquat on marijuana fields in Georgia. So the federal government, our government, using our taxpayer dollars, sprayed paraquat on Americans in Georgia.
I live in the giant brown spot in the US. I have worked around and with these chemicals. I'm 44 and have been diagnosed with young onset Parkinson's disease. So
yeah, we tend to think that, everyone's focused on genetics. So there's about 15% of people have genetics, and especially if you're younger, it's more likely to be genetic. But the vast majority of people who have young onset Parkinson's do not have a family history of disease, do not carry a known genetic risk factor for the disease. These toxicants are everywhere, and they're contributing to the rise of Parkinson's disease. And it's all preventable and all unnecessary and all for a weed killer. For a weed killer, really?
Right.
It's one thing to say we're spraying this pesticide to prevent people from getting malaria. It's an entirely different thing to say we're spraying this pesticide so people don't get weeds.
Dr. Dorsey, did you study the effects of lead on PD?
So there are studies that link heavy metals to it, and lead's on that list. I alluded to air pollution. So hitchhiking on those tiny pieces of dirt and soot that go back into our smell nerve cell, nerve responsible for smell, are heavy metals: lead from leaded gasoline, iron from brakes, platinum from catalytic converters. And we know in general metals aren't good for people with Parkinson's. We know that levels of metal in individuals with Parkinson's is higher than it is for the general population. So it's likely that heavy metals, perhaps through air pollution, perhaps through other mechanisms being inhaled, are contributing to the rise of Parkinson's disease. We know that lead leads to intellectual disabilities. We know another great example is agnotology. There's a book called Deceit and Denial, in which the manufacturers of lead paint knew about their risks of their own product, concealed them from the general public. If you remember the Dutch boy, is that his name? Who the little painter icon?
Painting, yeah.
Was to, make people wrongly be comfortable with having leaded paint around their children. And that contributed to intellectual disabilities. People have lower IQs today because of the effects of lead.
Is TCE still used in any decaf coffee?
Yeah, so in 1977, the FDA banned its use for decaffeinated coffee in the United States. TCE was also used as an anesthetic for pregnant women. until that was in the 50s and 60s, until that use also was banned by the FDA in the 1970s.
And what about chemicals used in dental offices?
People ask about that. I don't know. I don't know. I haven't seen any great evidence linking them to Parkinson's disease.
Okay, please update us on the new finding of plant pesticide chlormequat.
So
that
this is a
correctly?
pesticide. I didn't even know about it. And again, I'm a neurologist, not a toxicologist, not even a pesticide expert. But this pesticide, I think, also used in weed killing, has been found in cereals, including famous brand name cereals that all of you know. And it's been found in it. They've also found levels of pesticides in pregnant women increasing in Indiana as well. Many of these chemicals, like TCE, can cross the placenta. Many of these chemicals, including pesticides, are fat soluble, so they're found in the breast milk of nursing women. So women are transmitting these pesticides not only in utero, in their womb, but also when they're nursing their child. Their child's brain is developing, it's less protected than an adult brain, and these toxicants are obviously being exposed to a much smaller human than adults. So I think these children are extremely vulnerable to the toxic effects of many of these chemicals.
Is there any chelation processes that we can use to rid our bodies of these chemicals?
So they've looked at chelation therapy, and there are some diseases for where chelation therapy works well. Wilson's disease removes copper from the brain and the liver and works well. Nothing's been shown to be a benefit with Parkinson's disease. There was a recent study published in the New England Journal of Medicine, looked at an iron chelating agent. It took iron out of the brain of individuals with Parkinson's disease. Those people got worse. People with Parkinson's disease taking the chelation therapy got worse and much worse. And they were also exposed to the toxic effects of the chemical. So no chelation therapies to date have not shown benefit and have shown harm in Parkinson's disease. Not to say that we shouldn't be thinking about ways to do this. I think in some cases it's too late, the damage has been done. But what we should do is stop our exposure to these toxicants. So if I had Parkinson's disease, well, I don't have Parkinson's disease, and I buy organic, I wash all my fruits and vegetables with water and a soap. I recommend there are tons of things that individuals with Parkinson's disease can do themselves to hopefully slow the rate of the disease or at least minimize ongoing exposure to these chemicals.
Here's another question. Do these pollutants also cause essential tremor?
So essential tremor, we think, is likely primarily heritable. It runs in families. So there's likely a large genetic component to essential tremor. So environmental factors are less likely. Essential tremor is a tremor usually in the hands, the voice, or the head, or all three, associated with action not just at rest, but predominantly when someone does something. When they bring a glass of water to their mouth, they bring a spoon of soup to their mouth. That's essential tremor. Turns out people with essential tremor are a little bit higher risk of Parkinson's disease, but I haven't seen great evidence. Well, I'll just stop there.
And my wife has PD. We live within 1 to 2 miles of an abandoned Titan missile site. The ACOE has known for 30 years about significant groundwater contamination, has several test sites, but still hasn't come up with any concrete decontamination plan. Is there a vapor test we can order for our property?
Yeah, so you guys all making me an environmental toxicologist. So my understanding is that the test that you use for radon, which is essentially putting a canister in your home, is called a SUMO canister, SUMO. Can basically, and you just open it up and it's a vacuum and it sucks air from your home into the canister and you send the canister off to a lab. That same approach can be used to test for TCE in your home. If I lived near this site, I would be very, very concerned. I would be concerned if I lived near a site that I knew was contaminated with TCE. I would be concerned about vapor intrusion, and I would work to have my home tested. And it's the same thing if my kids went to a school near the thing. If I worked near a place, I would be concerned about it. And so you can get testing done, but you have to ask them to test for trichloroethylene and perchloroethylene. It's an easy remediation system. The same, like a radon remediation system for a home costs like, $2,000. So it's not inexpensive, but relative to the price of a home is, relatively, especially in LA, is relatively inexpensive. And it just sucks the air from underneath the foundation and vents it above your roof. So it's a relatively simple remediation system. And why we don't have these widespread for thousands of people millions of people who are living near these contaminated sites is unclear and must a readily remediable
No, it does seem alarming that the government is not providing these things for us.
We
But
need to make our voices heard. The government is responsive. Government does not lead. Politicians do not lead. They react. So it was Candace Lightner that went and made her voice heard, went every day to Governor Jerry Brown, and then they reacted. Until there are Candace Lightners, until there's Larry Kramers, until there are people who are willing to make their voices heard, government will not do anything in response.
right. There's one more here. My wife Marilyn has been diagnosed with PD for the past 5 years. She was exposed to paraquat on her farm in Montana in the 80s. It says, I have a liability litigation agreement here in front of me from Hoffman Law Firm, Texas. I haven't seen it yet. What is your thoughts on this with them? Do you have an alternative? Do you hear that there's a lot of litigation going on now?
There is, you can just do it. Listen, wrongdoers need to be held accountable. Wrongdoers need to be held accountable. If wrongdoers aren't held accountable, they only become emboldened. If we don't hold tobacco executives accountable for their misconduct, if we don't hold social media makers accountable for their misconduct, if we don't hold opioid manufacturers accountable for their misconduct, we don't hold opiate prescribers accountable for their misconduct, they only become emboldened and they only push the envelope. We see this throughout the political arena. If we don't hold wrongdoers accountable, they only become emboldened. Wrongdoers must be held accountable.
Right. I'd like to give this it's so much information with a lot of negative connotation. And I'd like to find a positive spot for us to kind of wrap this with. And I think, you can help me with this in terms of let's all become advocates. We advocate for our own health with our physicians every time we see our neurologist, but how can we as a group, if we get involved, if we go to your website, what are the things that we can do one person at a time to help ourselves, to help others and the general public as well?
So these are things you can do. If I had Parkinson's, I would avoid pesticides like the plague. I'd avoid it in my food. I'd avoid it in my yard. I'd avoid it in my golf course. I'd avoid it in what's being sprayed on my kids' playgrounds. I'd avoid it in my water. I'd put a carbon filter on my water. I'd buy organic. I'd wash all my fruits and vegetables with water and a pesticide wash. I would avoid dry cleaning, especially any dry cleaning that's done with perchloroethylene. My understanding is being phased out. I don't know what the status of the phase out in California is, but that's another thing that I would do. I would breathe clean air inside and out. I'd buy an air purifier for my home. When I drive through polluted parts of Los Angeles on the freeways, I'd roll up my windows. I'd recirculate my air. These are all things that we can readily do in our everyday lives to decrease our exposure to these toxicants. But fundamentally, the environment we have is a reflection of decisions that we make as a community. In the 1960s, the governor of California said we should eliminate all unnecessary driving. That governor was Ronald Reagan, who signed legislation leading to Clean Air Acts in Los Angeles, and we breathe cleaner air in Los Angeles. I'm going to be in Los Angeles in 2 weeks, and we breathe cleaner air in Los Angeles because of Governor Ronald Reagan, because of actions that ordinary Americans and our politicians made in response to pollution. If we do exactly the same thing today, we can all live longer and healthier lives. Life expectancy in the United States today is lower than it was when I was in medical school 25 years ago, and we spend 50% more on healthcare than we did when I was in medical school. We spend 50% more, 20% of GDP, over $4 trillion a year on healthcare in the United States. Life expectancy today is lower than it was 25 years ago, and life expectancy in the United States is 5 years lower than it is in France. If we change our environment, and California knows this better than anyone else, everyone remembers what California, LA looked like in the 50s and 60s. People wearing masks, not because of COVID, but because of the toxic effects of air pollution. If we clean up our environment, we will create a world that's not only healthier for us, not only will we be at lower risk of developing Parkinson's disease, lower risk of developing Alzheimer's disease, higher rates of independence and high levels of cognitive function, but we'll give this gift to our children, our grandchildren, and generations to come. We've done this for air pollution. California has led the way repeatedly on this front. We again need to do this to double down on our efforts and make our environment cleaner so all of us can live longer, healthier lives, free of doctors, free of medicines, free of disease, free of needless and preventable suffering.
I just want to say that there's a comment from Steve Fireman. Could the more publicly known folks with PD more easily get access to speak with Congress? Michael J. Fox, David Spinney, are they aware of your work? I want to say yes. I know that they are.
Yes,
And
the co-author Todd Scherer is a former CEO of the Michael J. Fox Foundation. Listen, Michael J. Fox has been it's hard to have Parkinson's disease. You all know that. It's terrible. It's a terrible, debilitating disease. It's really hard to have the disease and be the face of that disease. It's really hard to have a disease and to be the face of that disease. And Michael J. Fox has suffered like Job for the last 30 years. He cannot even walk down the streets of New York without falling because of Parkinson's disease, but he needs help. He and Davis Finney and Brian Grant and others need help. They need 1 million Americans making their voices heard and holding our politicians accountable for societal decisions that are leading to an environment that is contributing to the rise of Parkinson's disease. If 1 million Americans, especially we're coming in an election year, if 1 million Americans, from the right demographics, make their voices heard, we can change the course of Parkinson's disease, we can change the course of Alzheimer's disease, we can change the course of cancer, but we can't look to others to do it. We need to take that responsibility on ourselves. Silence equals death for people for HIV. Silence equals suffering, needless and preventable suffering for people with Parkinson's disease. We need to end our suffering. We got to stop being so polite. We need to make our voices heard. And when we do that, we will change the course of this disease so future generations don't need to suffer from this terrible disease that's increasingly abound everywhere we go.
I can't thank you enough on this note. Please, folks, write your senators, write your congressmen, write your local people. Let's take action. One email can have so much impact on our lives. And Ray, thank you so much. This was really amazing for you to share this information with us and how it really impacts California, those of us in Southern California. I know we have some people on here from Northern California as well. So, and also the UK. So maybe we can stop that export of TCE to the US or Paraquat from the UK. I mean,
there are tons of things. You can join the PD Avengers, a global grassroots organization run by people with Parkinson's disease for people with Parkinson's disease. It has 7,000 members in nearly 100 different countries. It's free to join, pdavengers.com. I'm a member of the PD Avengers. Senator Cory Booker in New Jersey has a bill that would ban Paraquat. It's evidently not going anywhere because no one's making it an issue. We should be banning Paraquat. Why isn't Senator Cory Booker's office getting calls from 1 million people with Parkinson's disease thanking him for an effort? And why aren't 1 million Americans with Parkinson's disease calling their legislators saying that we need to ban Paraquat? There are tons and tons of things that we can do individually and collectively to change the course of diseases. We have great models from polio, great models from Mothers Against Drunk Driving, great models from HIV about the huge benefits that we've inherited. We can do exactly the same thing for Parkinson's disease. I'd love to hear your stories. info@endingpd.org. If you can't afford a copy of our book, we'll send you one for free. info@endingpd.org. Just mail us your address. If you buy the copy, all the authors are donating all of our proceeds to efforts to prevent and end the disease. So tons of things that we can all do together.
So we can take action. On that note, I just want to say thank you so much for this opportunity to join us at PCLA. We have some wonderful events coming up, which I'll tell you about in a moment. But if you enjoyed today's program, please visit pcla.org and make your donation today. By donating to PCLA, you can join us in our mission to improve the lives of our families in the community living with PD. You can find our contact information at the bottom of the screen. PCLA is a nonprofit and all donations are tax deductible. Our upcoming events are really great. We have on Friday, March 29th, we are going to hear from an internationally registered dietitian, Rachel Flanagan. Please learn about the latest in nutrition for Parkinson's. And on Thursday, April 11th, join us for a special YOPD panel on navigating external expectations. Links to register for these events, as well as updates for all of our programs, will be sent out to you on our email list. You can also just visit PCLA and check our calendar. Thank you, everyone. Ray, thank you again. And we hope you have a wonderful day today. Be safe, drink clean water, and definitely get online and send a few emails out. Thank you so much.